Date with a Debut is recorded and produced on a Wapical country, and I pay my respects to all elders past and present and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show. Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you're looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, host of the show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoyed this show, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review. It really helps the show out. If you also want to hear episodes when they drop, be sure to subscribe to Words and Nerds, or you can subscribe to Date with a Debut on Podbean to hear the latest episodes as they drop. Want to support the show more? You can also subscribe to my Patreon in the description to get early access to episodes, book reviews, recommendations, and a whole lot more. Wherever you are listening, thank you for listening to us and supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. Today is a special episode, and it should come with a small disclaimer. Outside of Date with a Debut, my normal day job is working as a producer for an online sports website titled The Raw. And today's guest is in fact a colleague of mine. His name is Geoff Parkes, a crime author raised in rural New Zealand but now living in Melbourne. He's a highly regarded rugby writer, having contributed to The Raw for the last 12 years, and has also published a non-fiction book on Super Rugby side the Melbourne Rebels in 2024. But we're here today to talk about his debut crime fiction, When the Deep, Dark Bush Swallows You Whole, published by Penguin Random House, which you can get a copy of down in the description. We will discuss mild spoilers, so I recommend you get a copy now, or at least very soon. I started off by asking Geoff about the elephant in the room of us knowing each other and working together, the comparison of writing fiction to non-fiction, and pulling from a part of the world where he grew up to create a crime story. A small disclaimer about this episode: this book and this episode discusses topics of toxic masculinity and abuse, so listener and reader discretion is highly advised. Geoff, welcome to Date with a Debut.
Thank you, Nick. I'm delighted to be here. We've kind of known each other for a long time, so it is great to actually meet you face to face. And thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. And yes, I feel like for our listeners, we should kind of address the elephant in the room here to start off, and that you and I work together. We've worked together at the Raw. Specifically covering rugby union. We've talked a lot in our day-to-day jobs. It just feels like another day at work for me. To be honest, I'm just like, here I am, and here's Geoff again, and always talking about rugby, and you editing the rugby wrap every Monday. It just feels the same again.
Yeah, no, it does. And just so we don't scare listeners off, we aren't going to spend the next hour talking about rugby, but we do that, and it's great to be connected in, I guess, two different areas.
Yes, absolutely. But I feel like I've got a great opportunity here to, while I have you, because it is a unique opportunity to have someone who you usually work with in your day-to-day. I like doing the talk of comparison with writing fiction and non-fiction, and you have been busy. You have been so busy over the last year or so with your writing, because on top of writing this amazing book, which for all of our YouTube people on YouTube, I will now hold it up to the screen, When the Deep, Dark Bush Swallows You Whole. Really nice cover, by the way. I appreciate that. But you've also been writing another non-fiction book, which I feel like I should shamelessly plug it right now, which is A Year in the Life and Death of the Melbourne Rebels, which and I kind of want to say, even if you aren't a sport or rugby fan, I actually still think you should check it out, because it's a really great in-depth at the inner workings of professional sport that you might not be aware of, but also in that unique context, because it was the last year, well, for now at least, of a team playing on the field. And the reason why I bring this question up right off the bat is because I couldn't help but notice there was a bit of a weird similar brushstroke, because even though the audience is different, the genre is different, A Year in the Life very much details the happenings behind the scenes of the Australian rugby scene, particularly in the Melbourne context. But this novel examines happenings and goings-on based on in rural New Zealand, diving into your own past a little bit as well growing up. I might be overextending here with the comparisons, but I'm just curious because you would have been writing these two books at a similar time space over. How did it fit with Geoff Parkes, the writer at the time, juggling these two books?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nick. I think they're different enough stylistically that and the method that it wasn't really a problem. I was able to compartmentalize it fairly easily. So the rugby book was written in real time, so it was really a fly on the wall type of documentation of events as they were unfolding over a whole year, or just short of a year. So for me, that was pretty easy. It was a lot of observing and watching and note taking and talking to people, but it wasn't really my book. It was their book. And so I was just bringing all of that to the page. And it wasn't really until the very final section where I sort of loosened up and threw my sort of views and opinions into it as a review. So in that sense, that book was a pretty easy book to write. But it was more difficult emotionally, I guess, because of everything that happened during that year and the starting off with a lot of high hopes and expectations and then having that all taken away from them and dealing with the emotions of all the people involved. But then on the other hand, that gave me some hero arcs and there were some great people step up and do great things in what was a very difficult environment. So it was a pleasure to write. But you did right. There would be times when I'd come home if I'd been down at the Rebels for an afternoon or a day, and then after dinner I'd be working on my novel. And but I did find it pretty easy just to sort of switch lanes and if there are crossovers and similarities, perhaps they're just more related to my writing style. I think that's probably what links them. Rather than any content or any deeper meaning.
It definitely highlights to me, so many people be like, oh, you're a writer, you stick to that lane, you have a particular genre and you stick to that lane. It's another example of no, writers, don't put writers in boxes. It sounds like very much like your journalist background comes out in with this Rebels book, but then you also have the chance to dive into kind of covering crime and particularly NZ noir, which I mean, I've been lucky enough to have several Kiwi writers on the show at this point. Susan Frankham in series 1, talking about her crime book, Shadow Over Edmund Street. But there's a lot of other great books out there. Nobody Is Ever Missing, Catherine Lacey. I also got the chance to speak with the great Christine Lenenz on In Amber's Wake. And of course, she's known for Caging Skies, which is now became a big Oscar-winning Hollywood film. And I've suddenly really noticed, that book In Amber's Wake is kind of really set in NZ during the same period as your book, Sinking of the Rainbow Warrior in 85. There was the Springboks tour in 81. And talk to me about the world of NZ noir before we actually dive into your book, if I can, because the more I dive into New Zealand in the 1980s and read more books about New Zealand in the 1980s, the more I want more books to be set there, because it is such a fascinating historical point in time in the country.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it was a conscious decision of mine to set the book in the early 1980s. And there was actually a practical reason as well to do with the shearing elements that are in the book. And we perhaps can talk about that later. But more than that, I wanted to capture the essence of the time, everything you're talking about, and particularly when it relates to small towns, so life in a small town. And these were times, Nick, where a transition was taking place, and I think the Springbok tour is a good example of that, where the country was beginning to diverge a little bit on some national interests, important matters, whereas in the past, pretty much everyone was more unified in their attitudes, and it was very English sort of grounded community, and so at that time, yeah, there was a little bit of agitation about things, and particularly in the cities, and we'd seen a women's rights movement in the US in the 60s and 70s, and that was starting to take hold in New Zealand a little bit too. So we're talking about a very male-dominated society, and particularly in country towns, and that was something that I wanted to capture in the book, and not just male dominated, but attitudes to alcohol in particular. It was a hard drinking type of society, and women were often placed beneath that. And I was talking to a group in Auckland this week, and we were talking about experiences in the working men's clubs in the 70s and 80s, where it was common for wives or girlfriends to come down and in some cases bring meals, plates covered in tin foil that they'd brought down, and just sort of slide them in the door onto a table so the husband could have something to eat while he was drinking with his mates, and then he'd go home afterwards. And then there were other times, and one I observed, where someone who wasn't so happy, came in and basically threw the dinner across the bar room towards her husband because, he hadn't come home for a kid's birthday. So those types of things were pretty strong elements of society. And I hope I haven't overplayed it in the book, but I certainly wanted to capture that, the essence of that time. And and I guess the other thing to say though is that wasn't trying to pass judgment. It's I think certainly things have changed for the better, and it's a much more a better society in terms of the balance between male and female, and it's more egalitarian in a lot of ways, and social issues are now much better understood, and there's certain behaviours that have changed definitely for the better. But I'm not trying to say that all the people that were living at this time, all the men, were all bad, or that we should judge them. It really was reflective of the time, and I just wanted to make a snapshot of that. Now, having said that, as you'll be aware, a number of the male characters in this book are bad, but I,
Yes.
I'm certainly not trying to say that everybody was of the same ilk.
I think this will lead to a very good question that I'll ask you a little bit about later, and also a couple of the characters, because that element of toxic masculinity and abusive masculinity is actually a part of the book. It is there. It is from the front, and I mean, I kind of mentioned it in the introduction that, for any readers going in, there are some very confrontational moments in the book that definitely warrant a trigger warning if that is something that affects you in any way, shape, or form. But let's get into this book. Let's talk about it. This is, you kind of mentioned before we started recording that you've listened to a couple of episodes, so thank you. I appreciate that.
More than a couple. I'm, very keen to hear what new authors have to say, and what their pathway was through to publication.
Thank you. It's very, very kind of you, and very nice to hear. But seeing as we are at this part of the show where we kind of do, I like to do the elevator pitch to kind of get us started. I've hopped into the elevator. I'm here with you now. Give us your 1-minute pitch for When the Deep Dark Bush Swallows You Whole. What is it about?
Okay, so this is the story of a Finnish backpacker, Sanna Sovinen, who is working in a shearing gang in New Zealand just to help fund her travels. And the story's told over 2 summer timelines. So the first timeline is the work of the shearing gang over the season until the very end of that season, where she goes missing. And then the second timeline is a year later, told over the second summer shearing season, where her sister Amelia travels from Finland, and she's a bit frustrated and upset that the local police haven't been able to make progress and find out what happened. And she ends up teaming up with a guy called Ryan Bradley, who was the wool presser in the shearing gang, and he was having a secret relationship with Sanna. and then together they sort of between them sort of work to figure out what happened. So that's essentially the plot. It's set, as we discussed, in the early 1980s, and so there's certain elements there. And then I guess the other thing that is a major feature of the book is the setting, the landscape. It's set in the King Country, which is in central North Island of New Zealand, and obviously the bush and the mountains and river, all of that, and the small town that it's set in. All of those things contribute, quite heavily to the novel.
Nailed it. Bing! We've hit the elevator and we've now arrived. Hit our floor and we've arrived. Great summary, and I also love that we won't keep any of the spoilers here because it is a bit of a whodunit as well. There is that element of what happened, what happened here, and I love as well, particularly your mentioning of the area and the landscape, because that's kind of the first question I want to ask you about, because 1980s rural New Zealand feels like a character as much of as any of the other characters are. Specifically, your focus on small town New Zealand, King Country. It is a side of New Zealand that I feel like we should kind of see a lot more of. There isn't a lot of people around, but this is a land loaded with power dynamics. You've got the sheep station owners, the shearers, who are a crucial element and part of the community. There are business owners. There are different leaders in the community who exert pressure and who don't want uncomfortable truths to come out. And then, of course, there's the police, which is another element, particularly in Amelia's story and Santa's story. Even the actual places in the landscape hold weight. And you kind of touched on it before we started talking about it. I mean, hunting is a critical part of this landscape. Sport is very crucial as a social interaction. And the local pub is the hub, kind of a major hub of that environment. Tell me about recreating this world or making this world in King Country, because I feel like to understand the actual context for Amelia and Sana being outsiders coming into this landscape, it is a major part of this story.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really nice description you've sort of led into there, Nick. So thanks for that. There's that old saying, all writers hear it, and people tell them, you should write what you know. And in this case, that's really where this novel comes from. So, it's fair to say I haven't been walking around for the last 2 decades with a burning desire to tell this crime story, but I have had an increasing desire to write about the area that I grew up in. So that fundamentally underwrites the novel. I wanted to write about the region and have that come out in a fiction book, and then it was a natural thing then to think about, well, I need a plot. I'm always been interested in crime and read a lot of crime. So then that's where the idea for the plot development came from. And then, the work for me was not so much about recreating this world or landscape, because that was just something that I knew intuitively. But the work for me was to weave the crime story, a credible crime story and an interesting crime story, into the landscape. So that really was the guts, if you like, of writing the novel.
It's definitely the backdrop of, I kind of the word I like to describe when I was thinking about this book is it's like the backdrop of the tapestry. It's like the fabric behind of the tapestry, because a key thing about this book is you have a lot of perspectives here, like a lot of differing points of view. It's like 12 different characters that we see. Have I got that number right? I think I have.
It's either 11 or 12, but yeah. there are a lot, and it's we just touched on style earlier, and that's something that was a conscious decision of mine, not to tell a story just through the eyes of a main protagonist, or turn it into a police procedural or anything like that. I really wanted to jump from scene to scene or chapter to chapter and have it told through the eyes of somebody who's important to the story, but but not necessarily the main character. And so, yeah, that was the idea of that.
Yeah, and it's great as well that we kind of start kind of with the outsider looking in somewhat with Amelia arriving from Finland to search for Sana. There is, this is a time where there are no mobile phones. There has been no immediate contact. There's not that direct immediate contact that we have in today's world. She's been gone for a year. She's disappeared off the map for a year. And naturally, instinctively, given it is crime, given the setting, she is a character that you immediately, the reader, I found personally really latching onto. You're really in her corner because she's up against it with not just the landscape, but the people in the landscape and the time of the landscape that it is set in. Tell me about these two sisters, because as well, I think what was really particularly good I liked about Amelia is that, Finland is a very different world at this time compared to 1980s rural New Zealand, the literal other side of the world. And there is definitely a comparison and a culture shock that kind of comes with these two characters. And while, Sana originally went out to kind of get some miles on her soul, what she encounters and what they both subsequently encounter is very different in Nashville.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for anybody that's been to both New Zealand and Finland, yeah, particularly in terms of the landscape and the weather and customs, related to Scandinavia and New Zealand, they're wildly different. But there's also some similarities and connections as well. And, they're similar sized places in terms of the population and one main city, and then a lot of people living in smaller communities. And then it's mentioned in the book as well, there's one other connection related to drinking culture with males.
Yes.
And that's something I experienced when I went to Finland. And so in that sense, and I think Amelia talks about it at one point, but, in that sense, there are some similarities, and it seemed to be a natural thing to do to connect those two together. The other thing I think it's important to mention about Amelia and Sana is that, because there are these sort of strong, in some cases unlikable, but certainly, bad characters, and a couple of cases touching on evil, male characters, it was really important for me in the book and to give female readers in particular, but also male readers, some very strong female characters to latch on to. So I didn't want to, any of the female characters to be subservient or just along for the ride or anything like that. So both of these sisters, and also the wife of a farmer, she plays an important, Janet, she plays an important role in this book. And I really wanted to make them strong characters, give them lots of agency, and really counterbalance, that feeling that, well, there's all these bad men that live in this town, and I didn't want that to overwhelm the story. So both those, all those three female characters were really important.
Yeah, just because they experience that misogyny in environment doesn't make them weak. That doesn't mean
to it or anything like that, and they're not
correct
crusading against it either. They just happen to be strong characters, and they're able to develop their own character arc and journey, and get what they want, just by nature of who they are.
Yes, exactly. I think now's a good time to actually dive into some of these male characters and this male-dominated society that's in this town of Nashville. And I think there's too many different viewpoints that we can dive on in just one episode. I think it is important to talk about Ryan, very critical part of this story, and kind of alluding to a point you mentioned earlier. He's very much an example of, not all of these male figures are bad or brutal like individuals who commit abuse or commit violence, but he is someone. He's an example of someone who kind of increasingly, as the story goes on, he's someone who's very much, he's been in this community for a long time. He knows this place and space, but he's also in the process of making changes in his own life. He's come back from studying at university. He wants to become. He's going to finally sell the family home. He had a relationship with Sana, and I think the immediate thing that comes through in the book is Emilia makes him really refocus on this world that he has lived in and been accustomed to. I'm going to read a particular line from very early on in the book, which stood out to me, which I think nails a key part of this, of kind of the headspace that he starts on his journey on. Because a key point, and I'm not giving too much away by spoiling this here, is that Sana is not the first person to go missing in this story. There other people have gone missing as well, and there's this kind of whole idea that the bush, well, leading back into the title, swallows them. Yeah. So the actual line, which is from very on, I think it's on like the second or third chapter, which we see from Ryan's point of view, which is this bit here. Move on. That's what everyone wanted to do. Ryan, in that moment, standing at the entrance to the movie theater, knew it too. The bush didn't devour people like Sana, not on its own. Somebody had put her there. Great line, by the way. I love it. I love that particular bit because it's loaded. It's filled with so much. This is a world that he knows, and yet, who is responsible for all this? Who are these people that he knows that contributes to this? Tell me about him, because he is very much the straddler. He straddles between these worlds of these worlds of Emilia and Sana, trying to figure out what happened here, but also the world of Nashville. Yeah,
exactly right. So, he's in his early 20s, and he's, been going away to university to study to be a lawyer, and coming back in the summers to work in a sharing gang to, help fund his studies. So, straddling's a great word. So he's a local and he's connected to Nashville, indelibly, but he's also in the process of, professionally, he will be leaving the area to go and work for a law firm somewhere in the city and make his way in life. And he's really struggling with this idea that, he's becoming an outsider. So when he's back in town and working in the sharing gang, he considers himself still to be a local, and yet he's got people telling him, you're a fancy city boy now, you're not one of us anymore. And of course, the more they tell him that, the more he tries to prove that he is one of them. And so he is really having this identity, not a crisis, but he's struggling with this development phase of his life and belonging in two different worlds now instead of one. And that's a sort of a recurrent theme. And I like the way you put it, that with Emilia's arrival, she, being an outsider, is able to see this, and she gives him some pretty good advice in terms of how to deal with his old friends, and also, how to progress his life forward as well. And in doing all of that, he becomes much more useful with respect to finding out what had happened to Sana. So, there's also, he gets caught in a bind a little bit. This isn't giving too much away, but because he's going to become a lawyer, he did choose to keep this relationship with Sana private and secret, and not for any reason other than he just wanted to have something to keep to himself. It was nobody else's business. But of course, once she went missing, the police, obviously, they look to people that the victim knows, or the family members. In this case, there isn't any family members in New Zealand for her. And then just by him not making that relationship public, the longer the investigation goes on, of course, the deeper the hole he digs for himself by having omitted that information. So he's got the stress of that as well. And then he doesn't want to come forward at any point because he thinks he'll be, get into trouble, maybe charged with hindering the investigation. And then that will obviously feed into hindering his ability to become a lawyer. So he does have that added stress as we're going into the second part of the book.
His journey, I think, is really interesting in the story. Not that, I think particularly when tying into Amelia's own journey of trying to discover and figure out what happened. I think it's too hard for us to talk about all of these different perspectives that you bring in here, because there are so many characters. There is more than just these three individuals. But maybe pick out one or two. Tell me about some of the other figures in this story and how they weave into this tapestry that you've kind of crafted.
Yeah, well, having worked in a sharing gang myself for a couple of years, you're not short of material to build characters around. So there are some hard people in those gangs, and not just the males, I might say. Some of the female wool handlers that I worked with, they gave as good as they got. There's a lot of pranking going on. There's a lot of pretty sort of close to the bone sledging and stuff like that happening, almost every day. But there is also, a bit like being in a sports team, there's also a bond that develops between people because you are working hard and you have to work as a team cohesively. And so, you build up a relationship, a respectful relationship with people that way as well. And then you've got, all sorts of funny and crazy type of people at work in these types of gangs. So I took elements of people that I knew and made other pieces up. But there are a couple of favorite characters. There's a guy called Bull, one of the shearers, who is prone to doing some pretty outrageous things, but he's using shearing as a way to raise money to enable himself to set his own church up. And Ryan realizes pretty early on that, it's not really going to be a church. It's more likely to be a cult. And so he's a very interesting character. And there's, a really nice scene in the book where he goes into the bank, the local bank, and he's still dressed as a shearer, and he goes in there just to check on, when he can get the loan to build this church, and he's already got a substantial deposit paid, and he gets the news that the bank's not keen to lend him the money. And, and I think the guy in the bank says to him, well, there's sort of questions about your land use, and what you're going to use the money for. And he shouts back at him, look, it's a fucking church. What do you want me to say? And he's very threatening to the bank, the bank officer while he's doing this. So he was a really nice character to write and a lot of fun. But he's certainly one of these guys who's, perhaps got a real evil side to him as well. And there were some other characters. The farmer, Neville Hannigan, is unbeknownst to his wife, is sort of planning to abscond to the Philippines, and he's got a pretty unlikable edge to him. And then there's other characters that we think are nicer people, and we find out during the book that they're perhaps not as nice as we first thought they were. So immediately that sort of all that stuff throws up a lot of potential suspects, and that's important for the book too, and for that whodunit element that you mentioned before.
I think this is a good segue into kind of a last element that I want to talk about with this book, and that we've kind of been skirting around it for this whole discussion up until this point, which is, there's the outsiders element that is really kind of a key theme of the story. There is, the different settings and different places. People are in different journeys here, and I think the real thing that it comes down to is there's a real examination of power throughout the story. not just for people on the outside looking in, but then also, the actual things that are happening inside this community, in this space. We talked about it before we started to talk about the environment, particularly around this male-dominated culture that was very much prevalent at the time. With the perspective, and I think what's really good about this book is with this perspective you have with Amelia and Santa and other female characters here, you really notice this. You really, really notice this, and there are some scenes and actions by some of these characters that, I mean, I'm not going to go into full detail, but they're confrontational. There is a lot of they're confrontational to read on the page. There is a lot of toxic masculinity. There is a lot of abusive masculinity. There is a lot that 1980s attitude towards women is a key part of this story, because it is also about a woman has gone missing, and that feeds into that. Tell me about that, because I also think that would have been, as much as you were writing about it, I kind of looked at a couple of reviews and people said this is a blokey read, and which I take issue with a little bit. I take issue a little bit with people calling it a blokey read, because maybe it's just I had similar reactions to my book when my book came out, because while there are male figures, I think examining these particular topics and subject matters, while you do show a tapestry in different volumes of characters, I also think that just because it's not toxic masculinity on the page for toxic masculinity's sake, it's sometimes there is a point to why you are putting that front and center.
No, absolutely, and it's, as I said earlier, it's a snapshot of the times, and not every male character in the book is like that. So let's be clear about that.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'd like to think that there's a lot of levity and humor in a lot of places in the book. So it tends to get lightened up. And I was conscious of that as well, and then when something confrontational does happen, of course, that the idea is then that it has a much more powerful impact, because it's not it's not foreshadowed, or it's not like that all of the way through. I can understand, some of the dialogue perhaps for some people who didn't, live in those times, or in those locations. Some of the dialogue or conversation might seem a little blokey or different, but again, that's how it was. And it's not just it's not just that sort of, as you say, certainly not for doing it for that sake. But I'm just thinking about one little description from the book where they're talking about the local working men's club, and there being so for many years women weren't allowed into these establishments, and it was only in the sort of late 70s, early 80s where they started freeing that up a little bit, and there would be certain nights when the male members could bring along partners and guests, and there'd be a band or something like that. But they still weren't allowed to be proper members or come along whenever they wanted. And I remember going to a club, not in this area, in a different area, but I've put it in the book, where women were allowed in, but there was a gaffer tape across the floor, across the carpet, and they were only allowed on one side of the gaffer tape, and they weren't allowed on the other side of the gaffer tape. And that was because that's where the snooker tables and pool tables were, and the idea was that they didn't want the woman being exposed to bad language, or the men should be allowed to play snooker, and if they missed a shot, they should be allowed to swear, and not offend any of the women in the place. So and that was still in the early 80s. So it shows you what type of society it really was. And again, I'm not saying that was a bad thing, it's just how it was. And people can obviously and I want that to be part of the experience of the novel. So, it's just in that sense, it's a period piece, isn't it, Nick? And
Yeah, it
and
is. Yes.
and if people then turn around and say, well, I found it a bit blokey. Well, fair enough, and that's fine, but it's not blokey from an in-joke point of view or a sniggering point of view and saying, well, I'm only writing to one audience. And as I've been traveling around, the book's been out 6 weeks or so, and it is fantastic. The number of readers, male and female, and have come up to me and said, look, I really get it. I was really there. I got a real sense of what that community was like in that time.
Yeah, it's good, and I appreciate you kind of responding like that, because I think it is something that should be clarified with this book when people kind of look at that and examine that. What's next for you? I know that the book has been doing well. It's been out in the world. It's been getting a lot of reaction. We were talking before how in New Zealand it's been charting very well. You're up there with Lee Child, and you're up there in the charts and doing quite well. What's next? When will we see another great crime book from Geoff Parkes? Will there be another?
I did get a 2-book deal from Penguin Random House, so I have finished the second book. I've only just submitted it this week to my
Congratulations.
Publisher. Let's see what my publishing editor comes back with. It is a bit of a joke amongst writers, when you get your notes back for the first time, and you get a nice paragraph at the start, sort of, this is the best thing I've ever read, and this is wonderful, and then the second paragraph starts, and then the next 6 pages are full of everything that is wrong about it, or they would like you to consider changing. So there's a whole new episode and talking through the editing process, and sort of how traumatic that can be, but it's also a lot of fun, and it's also necessary, of course. So the second book is set in the same region. It's not a sequel or a series, but it's set 10 years later. So, we will be able to get a glimpse of or look into, how that society and cultural shift had happened over 10 years. And so it will be a different type of town. It is in the same town. A lot of it's the same, but a lot of it will be different as well. I've carried a couple of characters through, and they're in a different situation now, 10 years on. But it'll be that if somebody will be able to come to the second book without having read the first and still be able to go back, there'll be no spoilers. But for anybody who has read the first book, the second book will make a lot more sense. So, I guess that'll be out around this time next year. We've still got a lot of work to do to keep pushing this first book out. The reviews have been fantastic, really. You're always going to get individual reviews from readers that query certain things, but certainly the professional reviews I've had have been really supportive and positive, and it's a really nice period as a writer. I'm sure you know it as well, Nick. All that work you do to get the book ready and the stress of it going out on release. But once it's out there and you get to talk to people about it, and people come to talk to you about it, and send you messages through my website, the emails that I've had, it's really a nice time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can say with confidence that it doesn't stop. Like, the people will pick up the book down the track. People will kind of, discover, this book in a couple of years, and the messages will keep coming, which is always a very positive thing to always have in the background as you're dealing with, edits. God, the structural notes, whenever that document comes through, I shiver. I'm doing some short story writing at the moment, funnily enough, and the structural notes came through for this short story, and it was longer than the story itself. And I just went, oh God, oh no, what have I done? Burn it, or burn it to the ground.
No, it's quite a process we go through, isn't it? And just to even scroll down, tentatively, and can I bear to look at this or not? And then you do have a look, and then the next day you go back, and then you realise, look, it's nowhere near as bad as what I thought it was, and then you start to shift into a positive mindset because you realise that a lot of what an experienced editor tells you is absolutely worth listening to. And the thing I've found, even with my own editing and even on a weekly column, the more times you're able to touch it and go back into it, invariably it makes the work better. And if you've got an expert who's invested in your story and prepared to put that time in and provide you with feedback, it's a wonderful resource to have. So it's there's a lot of trepidation and fear about what they're going to say, but once you get over that, it's like dipping your toe into a hot bath. Once you get used to it, that little first sort of step, then it's all good after that.
It's a good analogy to describe it. Very good. We've now come to the rapid fire question part of the interview. You're very familiar with it, so I hit you with a bunch of questions, and you give me the first answer that comes to your head. Of course, being familiar with this, the first two questions that kind of come off the cab off the rank, and that is, of course, about the fact that you read yourself. You do enjoy your reading. What's your favorite book that you've read in the last 12 months?
Well, for someone who's now a fiction writer, I do actually tend to read a lot more non-fiction. And so I have read a lot of fiction, and I certainly read a lot of crime fiction over the last couple of years. But I think the book that stuck with me the most in the last 12 months is the biography of Joni Mitchell. It's called Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell by Ann Powers. And what I love about this book is that it's not really a straightforward biography. It's more about her experience of Joni Mitchell. And for anyone who's been a fan, as I have been through the 70s and 80s and beyond, I have my own sort of experiences and thoughts and emotions attached as well. So I really liked how she put all that on the page, and I'm able to agree or disagree on some things, and then relive my own experiences and relate that, to my journey along with Joni's music. So, yeah, I think that's certainly the best thing that I've read over the last year.
That is a fantastic answer. Joni Mitchell has had such an interesting life. I think I remember coming across hearing stories about not just obviously all the amazing records she did in her life beforehand, before she became a musician, which will not spoil, but she went through, definitely had a lot of adventures and had a lot of challenges. I love there was a story about how she, when you see her in the 1960s, she's got this beautiful angelic voice, and she's playing, on American television, and it turns out it's a voice that she hated. She hated that voice, and she spent years abusing her voice with alcohol and cigarettes to get it raspy into that kind of classic Joni Mitchell style, which I find is so fascinating because, obviously that angelic voice sounds great, but then all that character comes through later, the older she gets, as she's kind of changed and mutated her voice. That would be a big, that's going on my TBR that's taller than me. So,
yeah, no, it's definitely worth seeking out. And the other thing about it too, just quickly as a biography, we see this tendency now for autobiographies or biographies, particularly with sports people or celebrities or whatever, and they pump these books out when they're still in their 20s, or they haven't lived a full life. And everything you just said about Joni there, from having polio even as a young girl.
Yeah.
And then all of her art career and music career and her health issues. And, this is somebody who has lived a massively full life. And,
yes.
So they're the types of people that I want to read biographies on, not someone who's just done, had a hit show or won a World Cup or something like that.
That's the inevitable World Cup comparison with New Zealand comes in. It's true, but it's so true. It is really true. What's your favourite debut novel that you've ever read?
Yeah, well, I know this is rapid fire, and I'm struggling a little bit. So there's a couple that really jumped out. Train Spotting is one, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as well, which I really loved as a book and a film. But then I got thinking maybe those two books are rated higher because I love the films as much as I love the books. And I'm, now that a few years have gone by, I can't really differentiate, between the two. And so I've actually settled on Joseph Heller's Catch-22, which for me, I can't believe that that's a debut novel. That is just like an all-time classic, and the depth that was in that, and the humor and cynicism, and about war, for that to be a debut novel is incredible.
Yeah, you always have those authors that you go, how did you do that with your first novel? Like that's illegal. That's outrageous. You're a big lover of crime. Do you have a go-to crime trope with any crime books that you've read, or that you read, or that you've written?
No, and I've read a lot of, I read when I was younger, Agatha Christie, or all of those books. Being a New Zealander, Dame Ngaio Marsh, all of her books. So, they're the sort of traditional whodunit type crime novels. I read, Dick Francis, even, crime set around horse racing. I read all of his books. Then I read all of the James Bond books. And then I got into more sort of the US type crime writers. If you're talking about tropes, I think what I've learned, Nick, over the years is that I want to now read stuff that isn't formulaic, or that isn't based around a particular detective or anything like that. So I've moved away from that airport novel type of thing into crime novels that have a bit more, and they don't have to be set in rural. Well, I enjoy Jane Harper's work, and Chris Hammer's, and Margaret Hickey's, and all that. But so they don't have to be rural. But I just like something that's a bit edgier, or that's a bit different, and that really fed into my decision too, not to have a main protagonist who was trying to solve a crime. So it's more a stylistic thing.
Yeah, take the formula and mess with it a little bit, play around with it, I like it. Do you have a favorite word?
Favorite word? I should have thought about this beforehand. I'm not sure it's a favorite word. I tend to say absolutely a lot, which is probably not a good thing. I don't think I say it because it's my favorite word, but that is something that I do find myself saying a fair bit.
Yeah, it's a nice song. It's a nice word to say. There's good parts to it. You can go absolutely, or do any sort of like fun stuff with it. I like it. Of course, I'm anticipating for any rugby readers or listeners of both of our ilks. There would be probably a bit of a crossover who are here going, oh, but we're talking about rugby. So just to put you on the spot, who do you think is going to win Super Rugby this year?
Well, I did say at the start of the year, the Blues, who won last year's competition, would win again. They have since started pretty dismally. I do expect them still to make the finals, but I'm not so certain now that that they're going to be good enough to do it 2 years in a row. So, look, I think the obvious answer. There's a team called the Chiefs, who are from Hamilton in New Zealand, for non-rugby people, and they are certainly the outstanding team at the moment. And I was lucky enough to be there last Saturday in Hamilton watching them play the Blues, and it was an outstanding match. It was a terrific night, great entertainment, brilliant orange sunset that was setting behind the stands. So it was just a special place to be, and the game was decided, right in the last minute, and it was incredibly exciting. So that's my answer to that one. It's hard to see the Chiefs losing at this point.
I was really hoping you might have said an Aussie side in some way, shape, or form. I was really quietly, I know the Chiefs are the team to beat right now, but I don't know.
I think certainly there's two Australian sides, the Reds from Brisbane and the Brumbies from Canberra, who are capable of winning, and it would be no surprise if they got to a final and won. Anybody can win on the day, and they're both good enough teams. They're oozing with talent, and they're the most two settled sides of the Australian sides as well. So they've got the most continuity and cohesion from previous years. So yeah, absolutely they can win. But if you're asking me if I really, really, think they can, the answer is probably no.
Oh, don't you dare say that. No, refuse. But for the risk of as a final question for any of the author readers who are still here going, what are they talking about? The final question would be, what did writing When the Deep Dark Bush Swallows You Whole, what did it teach you in whether it be professional, personal, Geoff the writer, Geoff the person? What did actually having this book come out teach you?
Well, I think I've heard other writers talk about this. When you're able to start off on a book and then get to the finish, it does teach you a few things about your ability to be disciplined and be able to juggle a whole lot of things at once, right? So writing a book on a scale like this. It can be very pervasive and take over your life, and you can't help but every quiet moment, sitting on a tram or walking the dog or whatever it might, having a shower, whatever it is, you're always thinking about the book or the characters or where you're taking somebody or what the next move is, and then that can flow into your personal life, your relationships, your work life, or whatever else is that you have going on. So I think it certainly taught me that, I have to have the determination and the discipline to be able to finish the book off, but also that you can't shut everybody in your life out and it's a selfish enough undertaking as it is, but you can't be totally selfish and just say to somebody else in your life, or all your friends or family, look, this is the most important thing. You've got to give me the space to do this. And I mentioned the dog walking before, and just on cue, we've got two dogs who've decided to join the podcast.
I know it's hi guys, how you doing?
Yeah.
But I think that's a great answer. Nadia had Nadia Majuri on a few days ago to talk about it, and she also talked about you need to make space to ensure that if you are a creative person, you have to have that space, but it can't be all encompassing. It's always about straddling that balance, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's that's healthy for the book as well, right? You need to be able to have space to be able to come in and out of it and not inhabit it 100% of the time. But certainly you have to be aware that it can't just be all of your life. It's an important part of your life, but it can't be everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Geoff, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. For everyone listening, this beautiful book, which I'm holding up again, When the Deep Dark Bush Swallows You Whole, is published by Penguin Random House. It is out now. Go get a copy. It's I highly recommend it. Geoff, you should be really proud of this book. I think it's a fantastic debut. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. See you next week at work.
No, thank you, Nick. I'm delighted to have the opportunity, and what you do with the series is awesome, and I'm sure it's appreciated by every writer, and it's certainly appreciated by me. So thank you so much, and I hope for listeners, hope you enjoy reading it.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you, Geoff. Thank Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It really helps the show out. If you want to hear episodes when they drop, be sure to subscribe to Words and Nerds, or you can subscribe to Date with a Debut on Podbean to hear the latest episodes as they drop. Want to support the show more? You can also subscribe to my Patreon in the description to get early access to episodes, book reviews, recommendations, and a whole lot more. Catch you soon! Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art podcast co-production.